here is Nick Hoffman. He's from Hickory, North Carolina. And he's going to do a talk that looks at specifically using the popular culture medium of comic books as a historical lens. So, Nick.
What do you think when I mention comic books? Do you think about men and women in tights and capes beating up bad guys? Do you think comic books are for kids? I don't pay attention to any of that stuff. You are right in thinking that most comic books are for kids and young adults. But there are comic books that cater to adult audiences with themes that include alcohol, sex, drugs, and violence. Beyond the entertainment value, comic books can provide a lens into a specific time period, offering a critical assessment of the policies and practices of the government of that time. Using traditional narrative methods of setting, plot, and characters, two of the most popular comic books in the 1980s, Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns, provide a critique of the Reagan Administration's policies that severely cut welfare programs for those who needed it the most: the poor, people of color, and those who suffered from mental illness. When Reagan shut down government institutions and programs that served the mentally ill, control of these services were given to the private sector, which did not have enough resources to help all the people who needed it. Before the 1980s, most comic books were not political. When comic books first came out in the 1930s, they were lighthearted and did not portray violence or anything that was considered inappropriate to its young readers. Nevertheless, these early comic books faced opposition from teachers who saw them as a poor influence on students and their reading abilities. Preachers and religious groups also began to protest the sale of comic books to America's youth, claiming that the stories had, quote, immoral themes that would corrupt young minds. Unregulated, comic books that came out in the immediate post-World War II era shifted in tone and began telling stories that included violence and other adult themes. Major pushes to regulate comic books forced changes in the 1950s. In 1954, several comic book publishers formed the Comics Magazine Association of America and adopted a regulatory code for all comic books. In response to the Senate hearings on comic books, publishers chose self-regulation over government imposition of standards. To achieve the CMAA seal of approval, a comic book cannot have any themes that allude to sex, violence, or any other crude topics that the CMAA deemed inappropriate for its audiences. By the 1960s, a new subgenre called comics with an X emerged. These underground publications appeared all over the country and employed a journalistic style that often included adult and provocative themes. While this comic book movement was going on, the big publishers DC and Marvel Comics continued to use the CMAA guidelines until the 80s, when they began publishing more mature comic book stories. Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns were unique in the 1980s because they exposed the reality that the poor suffered during the Reagan era. In the first pages of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, readers see an older Bruce Wayne, the famous multimillionaire bachelor by day and Caped Crusader by night, 10 years after he retired his alter ego, Batman. As Wayne walks down the street of Gotham City, a stand-in for New York City, he passes by disfigured, impoverished-looking people that Miller depicts as mutants, who are outcasts, homeless, shabbily dressed, and dirty. The panel shows that one of the two mutants has a bottle of alcohol in his pocket, and both are shoeless. These mutants are not part of respectable society, and Miller uses these characters to symbolize the poor and disaffected in 1980s America. He emphasized this medium to critique the damage done to the powerless and poor as a result of Reagan's deep cuts to social welfare and mental health programs. These mutants see themselves as damned, but this depiction is not of the biblical Armageddon. Rather, they are forcing others walking by to see what society and the government have done to them. This is just one of the many examples that Miller uses throughout his story to critically denounce Reagan's social policies. Originally, a New Deal Democrat like his father, Jack, Ronald Reagan's conservatism began emerging in his early career. After graduating from Eureka College in 1932, Reagan went into sports broadcasting, where he covered the Chicago Cubs. He later became a Hollywood actor, starring in many movies and television shows. In the late 1940s, Reagan was elected the president of the Screen Actors Guild and re-elected 6 times throughout the rest of the 1940s and 50s. In the later 1950s, Reagan became the spokesman and host for the General Electric Theater on television. His political ideology began to shift as he traveled to GE plants around the country and gave rallying speeches to workers. Biographers claim that his role as a cheerleader of corporations encouraged him to become pro-business, which led to him to join the Republican Party, quickly identifying with hard-right conservatives like Barry Goldwater. Reagan was sworn in as the 40th President of the United States on January 20th, 1981. One of his first acts as president was to cut government taxes and social programs. Reagan believed the federal government had overreached its authority through what he called, quote, harsh and unreasonable taxes. Reagan and Congress went to work to cut taxes and the budgets of government programs that he believed were overbearing on Americans. Congress quickly passed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981, which provided a significant tax cut, creating the need to cut government programs and spending. These changes, however, came with a severe cost, the biggest being the budget cuts to social welfare and mental health programs that affected hundreds of thousands of Americans. Members of Congress followed the Omnibus Reconciliation Act with further budget-cutting legislation without fully understanding the consequences, one of which was the rise of homelessness caused by the cuts to social programs. In the Watchmen comic, published in 1986, author Alan Moore highlights the results of these cuts to social welfare and mental health programs through his portrayal of characters from different social classes. The superheroes that appear in the story were part of a group called the Crime Busters, which were comprised of 6 heroes who combated the crime that had been plaguing New York City. These 6 heroes represented different social classes. Ozymandias was considered the smartest man in the world and also had super strength. He represented the wealthy 1% of society. The middle class was depicted by the comedian, who had the ability of super strength, Night Owl, who had a genius-level intellect and created gadgets to help him fight crime, Silk Spectre had great agility, and Dr. Manhattan had the abilities to teleport and create and control matter at will. Finally, there is Rorschach, who represents the lower classes of American society. He is borderline homeless, but he is a genius and possesses superior detective skills. These heroes and their powers of advanced fighting abilities and genius-level intellect were different from the popular superheroes of DC Comics who used their supernatural powers to save the world, like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Rorschach, also known as Walter Kovacs, views society and government as corrupt and vile. In his first monologue, Rorschach describes the dirty streets of New York City with gutters full of filth and people who he calls vermin, who only care about sex, drugs, and murder. He proclaims that the day when all the politicians and criminals are crying out for help from their damnation, he will refuse to save them. Rorschach's anger at the government and society was formed in his childhood. Walter Kovacs grew up in a single-parent household with a mother who was a prostitute and abusive to him both mentally and physically. At a young age, he accidentally interrupted his mother, who was with a client. She gets angry and blames Walter for being, quote, backwards or mentally challenged. She then beats him with little to no remorse. We also see that Walter is bullied and beat up by other kids who taunted him about his mother being a prostitute. These traumatizing experiences led to Rorschach's development of a mental illness. Because he is poor, he never received any mental health treatment, which mirrored the experiences of mentally ill people during the Reagan years who suffered from a lack of treatment. By the time Kovacs was 16, he seemed to be mentally stable and coping with his past experiences. His journey to adopt his persona of Rorschach started when he got a job at a garment factory, where he handled women's clothing. He found a made-to-order white dress with black abstract designs that looked like a Rorschach test ink blot. The dress was never picked up, and Kovacs began cutting it up to where it no longer looked like a dress. One night, Kitty Genovese, the woman who ordered the dress, was raped and murdered outside of her own apartment building. 40 neighbors heard her screams and cries for help, but nobody moved or called the police to help. After hearing this, Kovacs could no longer stand the inhumanity around him and chose to create a masked face he could bear to look at in the mirror. The final push to his transformation came one fateful night when he was working a missing persons case involving a small girl who was later found murdered. That was the night Walter Kovacs died and Rorschach was born. Later in the story, Rorschach is arrested for a murder of a previous enemy of the Crime Busters, a crime that he did not commit. When the police detain him, they take off his mask and he suffers a mental break, screaming for them to give him back his face. Rorschach is convicted and sent to prison, where for the first time he receives mental health treatments. Instead of helping him, however, his psychiatrist uses Rorschach's case to further his career and become famous. Rorschach's suffering continues while in prison, as the news media claim he is a pervert and a white supremacist, further condemning him as someone not fit to be in society. Rorschach's lack of mental health treatment, because he is poor, demonstrates Moore's critique of governmental policies during the Reagan era. The issues of mental health treatment during the 1980s is also reflected in The Dark Knight Returns, also published in 1986. The character Harvey Dent, aka Two-Face, is one of Batman's nemesis. Early in the story, we see that Dent has been in Arkham Asylum, a mental health institution, receiving treatment for his years of criminality and insanity as his alter ego, Two-Face. Dent was a district attorney for Gotham City and a shining light of hope that was supposed to help redeem Gotham from the crime that had plagued the city. He suffered a psychotic break, however, when acid was thrown on his face during a trial against a mob boss. The acid burned the left side of his face, giving him his infamous look. It also burned one side of his lucky coin, which, as Two-Face, he flipped to see if his victims were to live or die. After 9 years in Arkham, Dent finally received mental health treatments and facial reconstruction. Unlike the treatments Rorschach received, Dent's was fully funded by Bruce Wayne, who hired an award-winning surgeon and a top psychiatrist to treat and cure Dent of his insanity. 3 years later, he was released, appearing to be a cured Harvey Dent. Dent's treatments demonstrates how middle and upper-class people had access to medical services that the poor did not. Miller denounces the mental health system that favored the well-to-do. Because he was an educated white person, Dent received top-notch treatment compared to the poor who were ignored by the government. Unlike Rorschach, the public were willing to accept and apparently cured Dent back into their society. Miller showed the class bias towards people who had a higher economic status and how they are given second chances. These two comic books were revolutionary because Frank Miller and Alan Moore forced their readers to see the suffering poor and the ways the American government discounted the lives of those at the bottom of society. They wanted their audience, who were mostly white boys and young men, to think about the dark side of American society where not everyone has the same privileges as they do. The authors wanted their readers to recognize the problems that can result when governments choose to support the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Through these two highly popular comic books, the genre was able to expand to reach more audiences. Popular culture, like the comic books, continued to influence and tackle other taboo subjects and other uncomfortable topics that have not been touched on before in American society. New hit television shows like HBO series Watchmen and blockbuster movies showcase the social issues that happened during and after the 1980s. Todd Phillips' film Joker, which is set in the 80s, shows what life was like for a poor person suffering from a mental illness. The mental health treatments of the main character, Arthur Fleck, has ended because the social welfare programs have been cut, a scenario that mirrors the events that happened during the Reagan era. Arthur's psychiatrist sums up this new reality by saying, quote, "They don't give a shit about people like you, Arthur, and they really don't give a shit about people like me either." Thank you.
Questions? I know there's got to be some comic book fans.
Just a historical one. Good job, Nick. you talked about the origins of the CMAA in 1954. We studied the Red Scare, McCarthyism. Was the origins of that any way a response? You find your research a response to the Red Scare at all?
Leading up to like 1954 when they formed it, I do believe that there was like a good aspect of that. But mostly what everybody was so afraid of was just, kids reading, some person being stabbed or, some
Violence and smut.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
What about, no, I forgot my question, sorry. I had a secondary follow-up, it's all right.
Other questions? Yes.
How did you come up with this topic? You were clearly born before these comic books would have been.
So, ever since I was little, I've always been kind of like this little comic book nerd. And when the movie Watchmen came out, I was way too young to watch it. And so, like, I've always been, like, trying to figure out, like, how to watch it. And then finally, like, 2 years ago, it was finally on Netflix. And I saw it, and I was like, this is pretty cool. And it's like, it's set in the 80s. And I went to Dr. Gilbert, and I was like, okay, so I'm a sophomore. Let's figure out a topic for junior sim. And he was like, well, I'm a pop culture historian, a culture historian myself. And I was like, I didn't even know you could do that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I just, wanted to do something with that. And then plus Reagan, where I come from a very conservative hometown of Hickory. And just like, I was always taught that Reagan was just like a godsend. And like, it's not like that he ain't, but it's just, you start to realize that there's more than meets the eye, So. Yeah.
Tell me what happens in The Dark Knight Returns and your interpretation of the work. Where does Superman fall into this?
So, the incorporation of Superman in that comic was kind of confusing for me, but in the story, Reagan kind of uses him as like a nuclear deterrent. So it's like Dr. Manhattan and Watchmen. He's like their last trump card, and plus Bruce Wayne basically violated their own version of the Keene Act in Watchmen, whereas like vigilantism is illegal, and if you do it, you're going to jail for a long time, or you're going to be murdered. And Superman was basically forced to take Batman down, and which he didn't. Yeah.
When were the two comics made?
So The Dark Knight Returns was actually a 4-issue comic that like came out periodically throughout 1986 and I believe 1987. I could be wrong on that one. But they like decided to just mash them all together in one big volume set. Watchmen was a, is it 12?
12.
Is it 12? Okay, yeah, 12-issue thing that came out periodically as well in 1986. 1985 and 1986. Yeah.
So, your best guess, how many of these comics were in circulation in the 80s? Like, how many, to your best guess, how many children would have read these comics?
Depends on the price. I would say the majority of white kids and even people of color, like kids were reading them. If they can find them and afford them. So let's say 85% maybe, just reaching.
And we had talked about this, that
Yeah.
it was hard to find the
Yeah.
statistics specifically for that era, that
Yeah.
really they started taking statistics after that.
Watchmen's never been out of print.
Yeah.
It was first published as one collection in '87. The author, Alan Moore, thought he was going to retain the rights to it so he could own it after DC made millions. And DC's never stopped publishing it. So the original contract he sold, which is why he doesn't support DC Comics or that movie or anything else having to do with corporate comic books.
So, how many comic book series were criticizing politics and policies.
Question?
Was it just Batman, or was it just like these two that you chose, or was it?
There were more. Originally I wanted to do 3 comic books, and Dr. Gilbert helped me with that too. There's this thing that Alan Moore did also called the Saga of Swamp Thing, and it tackles a bunch of issues like women and people of the LGBTQ plus community and other minorities. And then, of course, Wonder Woman, just most of them. But like if you read them, they're not as obvious as others. So like you gotta like read in between the lines a little bit. But like, even today in the movies and the TV shows that come out, they're like, you can obviously tell that they're trying to, get at something.
What made you narrow it down to these two specifically?
Probably the Netflix thing when I was probably too was good. No, that and also Batman's probably one of my favorite superheroes besides Rorschach, because like they're basically the same thing.